Corey Ackley, Hammer Steel Performance. All right, today we're going to talk about underdrive pulleys. We hear about them all the time. I see people asking, "Hey, should I get one? What does it do?" Well, today we're going to break it all down. We're going to break down what it is, what it does, and how it is used or can be used as a performance modification. And for you old school guys, this is no different than putting from a 308 rear end or a 273 up to a 323 or a 355 or 373 or 410s. Bottom line is we're trying to get a mechanical advantage to allow our vehicles to accelerate quicker. All right. With that said, let's get right into it and let's not waste any time. Let's find out what the heck are underdrive pulleys. Here we have a picture of underdrive pulley, and this pulley comes from Conquest Customs. I bought this, probably 10 years ago or so, maybe longer. But anyways, bottom line is this is the front pulley, the pulley that's on your engine, and basically this is a smaller diameter than your original pulley, which no different than in a 10-speed or a multi-speed bicycle. You're changing the ratios of the final drive ratio. And so this is a reduced size pulley that increases the mechanical advantage. What we have here is a picture of, under the primary cover, there is also another gear reduction. So basically, the crankshaft spins at a RPM, we'll say 3,000 RPMs. And you'll see here there's a middle pulley where your compensator is, and then you have, or a sprocket where the compensator is, and you have your final pulley on your clutch assembly. And so we have a gear reduction in there of 1.48. For a cross country, this is a hammer, so actually 1.51. But there's also another internal gear reduction that's inside of the primary case. I want to cover that just as we move into the other slides that will provide additional contents. So just to refresh, we have a primary reduction inside the primary cover from the crankshaft through the compensator sprockets into the clutch sprocket that drives the transmission that ultimately drives your pulley. Here we go. So on the left-hand side column, this column right here, this is the cross country with a stock pulley. And so basically what we're talking about here, this is the first gear ratio, 3.13. You multiply the first gear ratio by the primary, the three sprockets underneath the primary cover, and then multiply that by the final drive. That's the relationship between the front sprocket on the engine and the rear sprocket on your rear rim. So if you do 3.13 times 1.48 times 2.12, you get a first gear ratio of 9.38. And I've done that for each one of the stock gears that you have. Okay, in the center column over here, this is with a underdrive pulley from Scott from Conquest Customs. Again, that's who I recommend. He's the guy that's been building these for years and does a phenomenal job. And no, I'm not paid or funded by him. I just small business owner that makes a great product, and I want to give him a shout out. All right, so here we have an underdrive pulley. The underdrive pulley gives about a 7-cent reduction in gear ratio. So when we look down here at the primary drive, we still have the same 1.48 gear reduction that takes place within this underneath the primary cover. But we now, instead of having a 2.12 final drive between the front and rear pulley, we now have a 2.27 final drive. So our total gear reduction between the primary and the final drive under stock is 3.14, and under total is 3.36, and that's the gear ratios I referred to earlier. So this would be like going from a 308 gear to a 323 or a 327 gear. That would be the jump that you're making at about a 7%. And so if you do the multiplications on with underdrive pulley, you now have a ratio of 10.52 to 1 for the front pulley, and then you can go down the line. What I also done though is on the far right hand column, I've included what a stock challenger is. And so a stock challenger, they don't provide in their specs, they don't provide a first gear ratio and the primary drives. They basically tell you, hey, this is the first gear with all of the math done for you. So what we can see here is that if we compare the gears, you can see that outside of first gear, a Challenger is geared pretty low. It's even geared lower than a cross country with an underdrive pulley. All right, let's move on to the next graph and sort of start talking some math. What we have here now is this gets into the meat and potatoes of what a underdrive pulley does. So an underdrive pulley gives you a mathematical advantage. It multiplies your torque production. So what I've done here is we've said we've got a cross country with cams. It makes 115 foot-pounds of torque and horsepower. I'm not getting to the math to further calculate the effects on horsepower. Not effect on horsepower, but how the underdrive pulley will affect horsepower. We'll just keep it at torque. So with a peak torque of 115 foot-pounds of torque, so if we take our first gear ratio, total ratio of 9.38 times 115, to the ground, our rear tire is putting 1,130 foot-pounds of torque. And then if you take and do the math on each one of these, second gear, total ratio times torque gives you your, on this far right-hand column here, gives you effective torque multiplication. How are we multiplying what the engine's doing through a mechanical advantage to produce more torque to the wheels? Okay, so that's how that works. Now, let's look at how the underdrive pulley affects that. So now this is that same cross country with an underdrive pulley. And again, going through the same math problem, right? If we multiply any gear ratio by the torque, peak torque at a given RPM, that would give you the effective torque multiplication by gear. And so I'll show another graph here that compares them side by side. But bottom line is that is how they compare at multiplicating torque. Now what we've done here is taken a stock Challenger. So again, the stock Challenger on the left-hand side is the gear ratios that the final gear ratios that have already been through the final drive and primary multiplications. Stock Challengers are anywhere from 112 to 116 foot-pounds of torque and 103 to 108 horsepower. So using the same 115 foot-pounds of torque, we do the multiplications and it gives us, the effective torque multiplied by gear. All right, but what does all this mean? What does this mean for me rolling down the road? So what we have here is a comparison. So on this comparison here, we have a stock pulley cross country, a cross country with an underdrive pulley, and a stock Challenger, both making 115 foot-pounds of torque at peak. And this is what under full throttle, that torque would be multiplied by to give you that effective torque multiplication. Okay, so what we see here is that in first gear, the cross country puts 1,100 foot-pounds of torque on to the ground. The underdrive cross country puts about 1,200 foot-pounds of torque to the ground, and the Challenger is 1,170. What gets interesting though is when we start getting to the other gear ratio, you'll see how steep the stock Challenger is actually driven. So in second gear, about 729 foot-pounds of torque are to the ground. The underdrive pulley is about 781, and then we see the Challenger is 797, almost 800 foot-pounds of torque to the ground in second gear through the torque multiplication. So I think it's really important while we're talking about the pulleys and the stock pulleys. And this is not a video on Challengers, but for those of you that have raced a Challenger against somebody that knew what they were doing, they're fast. They're really fast, even in stock form, and they're stupid fast when they're flashed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But anyways, with that being said, this is what we have here is representation of a 115 foot-pound of torque bike. And under that example, this is how that torque would be multiplied to give you a mechanical advantage. You can clearly see the benefits of the underdrive pulley in regards to how it multiplies torque. Now, with that said, it also comes at a cost, and that cost is you're going to be at a slightly increased mile per hour, slightly increased RPM at the same mile per hour. Okay, because the bike is geared lower, and that effective gear ratio makes it accelerate quicker. But the mechanical advantage, just like being a 10-speed bicycle, if you put that thing in first gear, your legs are going 1,000 miles an hour, but the bike is barely moving, but it's very easy to go uphill. It's the same concept here. Okay, let's look at one more comparison. All right, so here on the left-hand side, we have a stock pulley XC with a 116 or 117 big bore making 130 foot-pounds of torque. And on the right side, we have a stock Challenger. Lloyd's Flash, 120 foot-pounds of torque. And then what we see here is in first gear, we have 1,278 foot-pounds of torque, massive big bore torque. And then obviously on the Challenger, it has 1,220. So it's down 58 foot-pounds of torque in first gear at peak torque. But the remainder of that, which I thought was interesting as I was doing this ratio stuff, the remainder of that, the Challenger actually puts more torque to the rear wheels because it has even a greater mechanical advantage than that of what the big bore can overcome with a stock pulley. Now, if you were to put the underdrive pulley onto that big bore, then you would be crushing this Challenger over here on the side. But the only reason why I'm bringing this up is because I've had people talk to me about how fast a Challenger is, and I kept telling them, yes, it is fast. It has a massive mechanical advantage over a cross country. And now we get to see it. All right. Let's close the loop on this and let's see what other things we can talk about. All right. Yeah, I just want to wrap this up. So a couple things. One is obviously I oversimplified this, but you get the idea. And what I mean by that is that every RPM, and we use this under full throttle, but it can be under any part throttle, it multiplies your torque production. The examples that I used were at peak torque. So if your bike made peak torque and you're at full throttle, and it made peak torque at 3,500 RPMs, and it was 115 foot-pounds of torque, then that's where you can multiply that point. but it would be whatever that torque production is at any given point is what's being multiplied. The other thing is this wasn't about Indian Challengers. I used them in there because of, I know people that have gone from victories to Indians and they're sort of amazed how quick these things are. And I told them, I said, well, you got a pretty good multiplication. They're geared pretty low and therefore they multiply their torque more so it makes them quick. Um, but like I said, the underdrive pulley is a great tool. It has its advantages. There are some disadvantages, as I mentioned. You will have some increased RPM at the given RPM. Your speedometer will be off if you don't do a healer or something like that to recalibrate the speedometer. But by and large, it is a good compromise between not having something that revs way too high at highway speeds, but also gives you a decent torque multiplication. So for that one person that's still watching us at the end, like, share, subscribe. I always like to say share. And thank you. We'll close this thing up.